Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me all right. And if we have any problems, do signal in that regard. So nice to be here, nice to see you all again. Most of you know I got stuck in New Zealand for nearly 8 months this year, couldn't get back into Malaysia. So working online has become something of the norm for many of us this year, unfortunately. Today we're going to look at this topic of assessment, and I've been asked to base this and give an overview of Martyn Rawson's article on the topic. Agnes, are you going to do the slides, are you? Yeah, okay. So I have prepared some slides for you, and I'm assuming that you may want to look at these afterwards, so I'm happy to make them available to you after the session today. Yeah, so assessment, a Waldorf perspective by Martyn Rawson. We'll have a look at that, and then we're going to dovetail into hopefully a constructive discussion about assessment practice and what that means for us in our teaching in the Waldorf context. So I guess one question would be, oh yes, the way I see the session working is we'll give a summary of the article, which will take about 30 minutes. So I'll pull out the key points. I'm hoping that you've had a look at it already, so that makes sense to you. Then we can have a bit of an interactive discussion and have sharing and questions, and then we can think about what that means for us going forward at the end of the session. I've put the page numbers on the top right hand corner of the slide, which begins on page 30 of the article, so that if you are looking to try and locate the information in the article, you can find it more easily.
It's my first time doing this because I'm controlling another person's screen at the moment. So there might be some technical difficulties over here. So please be patient.
So we need next slide, please.
Yes, I'm working on that. There you go.
There we go.
Okay.
All right. So just to be clear, who is Martyn Rawson? Do we know who he is? I do, and I know some of you do. There's a couple of us who are undertaking a master's program in which Martyn Rawson is involved at the moment. So if you're not 100% clear, he is the author of the tasks and content of the Steiner Waldorf curriculum, the yellow book. And in fact, I'll just this book here, right? I think we all know it. So he's the co-editor of that book with Kevin Avison. Martyn has also been a Waldorf teacher. I think he was a class teacher in York originally. He's from the UK, but he's lived in Germany for many years. His wife is German. He's a teacher trainer today, a researcher in education, and he's based in Kiel, right up in the north of Germany, where they have a Steiner school that has nearly 2,000 students. And he lectures in Hamburg and Stuttgart, and also in the Taiwan program at Tsinghua University, in which some of us are currently enrolled. So I think a question for us today as we move forward is, why did Rawson write this article? What motivated him to do it? We're going to come back to that at the end of the session. So Rawson points out, he starts by talking about 3 aspects to the question of assessment: the what, the how, and the who. So the what being observable, measurable facts, is the how being the relationship between the learner and the teacher, and the who being the person's learning and developing. And that is both actually the learner and the teacher. We generally assess the past, that is, things that have happened, what we have done. But Rawson points out that assessment also gives us a glimpse of the future, of what is emerging, what is coming. Yeah. In the context of assessment today, we need to be aware of the historical and current dominant education culture, one of performance, accountability, ranking and competition, and ultimately, Rawson suggests burnout. This culture actually came about, really, it was very prevalent in the mid-20th century, at a time when Waldorf schools really expanded around the world. And many teachers who I think got into Waldorf education reacted against that culture, quite understandably. So we can see assessment as having to do with the question, what grade did you get in school today? Yeah, which is when we ask that question, we are essentially objectifying, we're labeling and we're judging. Yeah. Or we can see assessment as having to do more with the question of what interesting things did you do in school today, which is a more respectful, intentional statement, showing interest in what a person is learning. And Rawson points out two ways of learning about the world, and this perspective is very well, I think when we look at certain educational institutions, they're very characterized by, some of them are more characterized by one than the other. So one way of learning about the world is in an outcomes focused way, and the other a process focused way. So from an outcomes focused point of view, we are interested in capturing information and dissecting and analyzing that information. And we tend to use that for labeling or categorizing. And at its extreme, this is about exploiting aspects of the world, really. This mastery and exploitation of knowledge and information in the world. It is a view that comes from or values quantitative data, yeah, of figures, percentages, information that is put in numerical terms and is empirically verifiable. Yeah, we can touch it, we can see it, and those figures speak loud. And then we can also think about the process-focused perspective, which is more to do with careful watching. He says, in a mood of gratitude and an assumption that there's always more going on than we can perceive in any one moment. We can't quantify everything. This is more to do with trying to understand people's rich experience and how the learner is changing and responding and transforming in the context of the learning. And this is very much qualitative in nature. We're interested in the learner's experience. Rawson says assessment is moral action. Assessment necessarily involves making judgments, and how we value and reward a student's performance carries a moral message. If we assess only the student's cognitive or thinking skills, then we lower the value of everything a child does. So in Waldorf, we need to understand social expectations regarding measurement and attainment. He is referring to parents and the community as a whole, so that our pupils are not isolated in some kind of cult or inward-facing reactive culture, but are very much in relationship with society. Our students must get the necessary qualifications to access a profession and university or higher learning. And Rawson says this is all possible while espousing a non-competitive approach to learning. So what effect does assessment have on the whole child's being and their future? Does it unlock doors? Does it open windows? Does it encourage learning? From Rawson's perspective and mine too, Waldorf teaching is an iterative process. It is dialogical. It is a process of doing, of observing, of contemplating and reflecting in order to shape pedagogical situations that are ripe for learning, in which children can learn and develop. And given all children are different and process their experiences differently, we need to think about what that means in the context of assessment. What does it mean to be an inclusive teacher? The implication is that we must differentiate the learning tasks and the assessment task and our expectations as a teacher. So Rawson emphasizes, and I also very much concur with this, that we need to be thinking about the assessment of teaching before the assessment of the pupil's performance. A balanced approach to assessment has to look both at the teaching and the outcome of the teaching, in other words. So assessment involves a cycle of reflecting on and in the process of and for teaching. And this is really its primary purpose, I guess. So that means reflecting about pupils and their work, what pupils say, how they do their work. It involves the teacher knowing what to do in the moment in the classroom, yeah, weighing up the next move. And in this sense, assessment's happening all the time. Assessment is an integral part of our teaching practice, not just when we feel like doing an assessment. Reflecting on is about looking back at what has happened. Reflecting in and while teaching is noticing how the children are responding to us and our teaching, and knowing how we need to respond and change what we're doing from a pedagogical point of view because of what we're noticing. And reflecting for teaching is about planning, anticipating, and preparing our lessons. In this sense, assessment is something which is tentative, not certain. It is provisional, not confirmed. It is iterative and ongoing. It's an integral part of our work as teachers. So I think it's interesting that Rawson has turned the camera or the lens onto the outcomes of some work by people who are working outside of Waldorf education. These are people who've been involved in research on assessment for a number of years. And one of those people who's been very influential is John Hattie, Professor John Hattie, who's a professor at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. And he says to us as teachers that we need to know the impact, know thy impact. We need to perceive how the children respond to the learning situations that we create. And as teachers, we need to learn from this and adjust our approach accordingly. In other words, there's a mirror and the children are reflecting what we are doing and how we are doing that back to us, and we need to adjust what we're doing. And the implication of this is that we focus the assessment more on our teaching, observing the effects of that teaching on learning. The purpose of assessment for learning, which is a phrase or a term that is used today, assessment for learning, is to give the students reflections and suggestions in a way that they understand their next concrete steps. Learning is not a mystery, it's demystified, and they have some clarity about what they're trying to do or what they're aiming to do next. And supportive, tactful, helpful, sensitive and practical responses are needed from the teacher to facilitate that. So if we think about what we've just been talking about, assessment as reflection for action, it occurs to me that some of these questions are very important for us. In every lesson, when we finish the lesson or when we finish teaching and move to a non-contact period in the day, we need to be asking ourselves the question, was the lesson productive? Were the students positively engaged in learning? How effective was my teaching? And how do I know? Was my teaching engaging all students in the room? I don't know. Where's the evidence, in other words? What did I notice? You know, I would say that in my observation as an experienced teacher and manager, leader in education, when I go into classrooms, what I have observed is that some of us, after training, are able to engage some of the students in our classroom. We're able to meet their needs. And a smaller portion of us are able to engage most of the students in our classroom and meet their learning needs. But not very many of us are able to engage and meet the learning needs of all the students in our classroom all the time. And when we think about solving the riddle of the child and our task as Waldorf educators, these are very important questions for us. These are not questions that are to do with state education or government education or any particular education. They are fundamental questions, ethical, moral questions about our task as a teacher in enabling learning and to be aware of the impact that our teaching is having on learning and the students in our care. Yeah, this is very important. Thank you, Agnes. Next slide, please. So there are a range of approaches to assessment that Rawson talks about. And he talks about assessment in Waldorf schools being about assessment for learning and assessment of learning. He talks about ipsative assessment, which is pupils' performance is evaluated against their own prior performance. Yeah, and we need to be aware, what can this child do today compared to what I noticed 3 months ago at the beginning of the year? This is about individualizing assessment. And he also talks a lot about formative assessment, which is process-oriented and is best used during a lesson to make adjustments to the learning process and to offer reflections and feed forward to students about their learning. We talk about feedback, but we can also talk about feed forward, which is about linking our observations to what needs to be done next. And this is the purpose of formative assessment. And there's also summative or outcomes assessment. This is the form of assessment I think most of us are most familiar with. In other words, a test, yeah? Summing up what has been done at the end of a block of learning, an end of main lesson test, an end of unit test, a test in term 3 on what we have covered in science over the last 2 terms. It involves a judgment based on clear criteria and learning outcomes for achievement, the knowledge and skills that we are trying to develop and we want the students to demonstrate. We need to be careful to be clear as to whether we are assessing memory, what a child remembers, or assessing understanding, what they can do and what, for example, problem solving. Outcomes assessment can also be used to establish developmental markers. In other words, we often do a class 1 readiness assessment or a school readiness assessment. We may assess reading, writing, or numeracy skills and knowledge. And in Waldorf, the place of this type of assessment is more done from a point of view of diagnosis to establish what a child knows and where are the gaps for our attention, rather than as an instrument of selection. A range of assessment tasks is needed, since no one task is likely to involve all the skills, knowledge, and attitudes to be assessed. Now, if we look back at assessment in the 50s, 60s, 70s of last century, really it was pretty much, I think, majority was summative and outcomes assessment. And there are still some quite high profile qualification systems in the world today that rely very heavily on summative and outcomes assessment. One, for example, is Cambridge with IGCSE, which is very exam-based. And the problem with an exam, when it is being used to determine a large part or all of the student's grade, is an exam is crude. It's only measuring that child's performance at one point in time on one day. It doesn't give us a very sophisticated picture of that student's knowledge and ability. It is a blunt or crude assessment instrument. And today, assessment theory and understanding have progressed so that we can see that there's much more to assessment than summative or outcomes assessment. But it doesn't mean that summative and outcomes assessment isn't valuable. It is. It's part of the whole. So we were talking about diagnostic assessment here, and we use that to determine gaps in prior knowledge, what the child knows already, and to find out which students may need some additional support. If we're coming back to perhaps, for example, in mathematics, to geometry and to the properties of angles and measurement, we might need to do a pretest to find out what the children can remember from the last time we covered the subject. In that sense, we're using outcomes assessment in a diagnostic way. So we're clear about what we need to reteach and revise before we can move on to a higher level. Assessment for learning, we mentioned it briefly before, is understanding where learners are at in their learning. That's why we do it as a teacher. And not only where they're at, but understanding where they need to go next and how best to get there. It's about identifying next steps and paying attention to those and helping the students themselves to be clear about that. You know, when I go into a classroom, I quite often will ask a student, when I'm teaching, but when I'm there to look at a lesson, I'll say, oh, so tell me what you're doing there. And when you finish that, what are you going to do next? What do you think you need to do next? And why do you think that? I want to know if they're clear about that or not. Evaluative assessment is where we use assessment to assess the quality or effectiveness of our teaching. There's also peer assessment and self-assessment. I don't know if any of you have used these forms of assessment. They become more possible when we get up around class 4 or 5 level. We need to be quite careful in the utilization of peer assessment. It's best done when we focus on a specific aspect rather than in a sort of broad way. It involves, I think, engaging students in co-constructing the assessment criteria and the process, or being clear about that together. How would we know if we had delivered our speech well? What would be some of the things that we would know made our speech successful when we are presenting to the class? These are things that are very important if we're going to engage peer assessment or self-assessment. It strengthens the students' awareness, this process of co-construction or agreement with the students. It strengthens their ability to assess themselves and to be self-reflexive about their learning. It has its place in a Waldorf school. It is not something that is irrelevant to our task at all. But we need to be very conscious about what is age appropriate when we are thinking about this. So there is another means of assessment, and that is the collection of naturally occurring evidence, sometimes called NOE. And Rawson gives us some examples. He talks about competence portfolios, which are used in Europe, and something similar is used in Australia and New Zealand. And these can be used to record competencies or capacities in informal learning situations from, for example, work experience, practicums, class projects, plays. And you need to come up with some guidelines for that if you're going to use that as a method. Naturally occurring evidence is that which is derived from activities in a range of contexts over time. Evidence should not be derived from a contrived assessment activity. It's something that happens when the student doesn't even know they're being assessed. You know as the teacher what you're looking for, and you're going hunting for that information, but the children will be none the wiser. And evidence can be in any form that relates to the competence or the capability that we are trying to foster as a teacher. Student work completed independently in the lesson is valid. Someone's got their mic on. Lily Liu. So work that is completed independently in the lesson is absolutely valid. And we can also photograph student work that was independently completed as to evidence or as an example of what they have done. Participation in a reading or a maths group session where you're sitting there with 3 or 4 other kids in front of you and you're asking some questions. For example, maybe you're wanting to see that students understand how to simplify a fraction. Yeah. What we need to do to the numerator and the denominator of the fraction. And in your maths lesson, the student says, oh, I know, we need to do this, and they tell you that, then that's naturally occurring evidence, and you can note that. You can make a record of that somewhere, that you saw that on that date, and you were very clear that student had understood that. That's valid assessment evidence. The child had no idea they were being assessed, and you've collected the information. Naturally occurring doesn't mean spontaneously occurring. We still need to design tasks to create opportunities for students to demonstrate the competence. We need to be clear about the skills and knowledge that we are working to develop. So before we assess, there are some things we need to think about, and this is what Rawson is suggesting here. We need to think about what to assess and how we're going to go about that. What will this assessment task look like? What are our aims? What are the potential consequences of that? How will we prepare the way? This is a matter of setting up the conditions for that to happen in a meaningful and valid way. And that's a matter of our planning and preparation as teachers. So in relation to the assessment task, it must be clear to the students in order for the assessment to be valid. It must afford opportunities for the student to use the competence, the skill or knowledge appropriately. It should be set in a meaningful context that the students experience as relevant, for example, a performance. If we're assessing writing, we're going to get a much more meaningful sample of writing, independent writing, if the students are writing about a topic that they know or with which they have been recently connected, rather than something that we've never discussed before. Assessment should occur over time, ideally across multiple contexts. That's quite interesting, isn't it? That's quite significant. We have a senior Waldorf educator telling us that assessment should occur over time across multiple contexts. And both the learner and the teacher need to be clear about what kinds of evidence are required. Not in an intellectual way necessarily with younger children, but we need to know what is being expected of us as the student, and we need to know what we're looking for as the teacher. Clear assessment criteria are needed. This comes back to our planning as teachers. Fundamentally, the assessment process should empower learners by helping them to understand their own learning better. In Waldorf, we talk about how the metacognitive dimension of children's awareness and thinking really begins to take off in class 6. And this is a time when we can really give more attention to students' own self-awareness about how they learn best and things strategies that they need to employ around their own learning. Clear responses and suggestions feed forward to the student based on the evidence is important. We need to make the progress, achievement, and next steps clear to the students. How will we do that? Have we thought about that before we jump into the assessment task? And I think something else that Rawson points to and is important for us to bear in mind is that when we make an overall judgment about a student's level or competency, then we need to base that on several episodes, not just a single event. Several assessments should be taken into account. As a teacher, when we write a report to a parent at the end of the year and we're making a statement about a child's skill level or what they need to do next, on what basis are we making that? If it's just on one assessment on one day, it's not very defensible. If we've got evidence from a range of activities, some naturally occurring evidence, some formative assessment, a couple of outcomes-based assessments at different times, we've got plenty of evidence on which to base our judgment, and we can defend that judgment. This is important. Rawson also talks about record keeping, monitoring and tracking. So we do need to keep some kind of records of what we have observed and the results of assessments over time, which we can look back to use as a basis for reporting and thinking and planning. And what sorts of things do teachers keep track of? Well, I made a list. So attendance, whether a child is at school or not, that's pretty important. Punctuality, whether the student is actively participating in a lesson or whether they just sit there quietly as a passenger. Do they do their homework? Completion of assignments and the outcome, the grading or whether the skills were evidenced or not. Outcomes of formal summative assessments, maybe their end of main lesson test, their reading comprehension test, for example. Ongoing issues that may arise in learning, behavioral or other. Emotional, we may make a note of those things. Learning support reports. If we need to refer a student to the learning support department, we need to prepare a child study, for example. Other relevant information. These are all things that as teachers we need to keep a record of, and we can look back at and correlate in forming a picture about how a child is progressing in their learning. So when we report on assessment, we need to think about how we go about this. Again, this is a question of moral judgment. So we need to characterize the student in writing in a report. Rawson talks about this in the article. This means talking about their strengths and areas for development. And effective school reports are an evaluation of the student's participation in school. Their social behavior needs to be described. A short summary of the curriculum or what has been covered in each subject is needed. And the main learning outcomes that we're sort of looking for at this particular stage of development. The students' main aims, main attainments, the things that they have achieved or progressed with, need to be noted. Comments about how they worked, what they found difficult, challenges that they overcame, what was easy for them, and in what areas the progress was made. And then, most importantly, we need to point towards their next steps in learning, attitudes, and behavior that need to be put in focus going forward. In this way, a school report is effective and informative for the parents. When we are thinking about grading of student work, that means using a rating scale of achievement. There are a number of things we need to take into consideration according to Rawson. So grades are only meaningful for the student when accompanied by feed forward. Grades on their own are simply a judgment, nothing else. Grading is problematic, Rawson says, unless accompanied by a structured marking scale. And without this, the research shows us that teachers tend to be subjective, and they will tend to give the students they find temperamentally similar and in alignment with them, they will tend to give those students higher grades than other students. So it's important that we have some kind of assessment framework or marking scale that sits behind any grading of student work. If we give students grades, then it's best if we accompany that with written reflections. But very often the students will only pay attention to the grade and won't look at the depth of comments that we've attached to the grade. There is something called a rubric, an assessment rubric or matrix that we can use, which is possibly more constructive than grading and can be referred to during the unit of learning, depending on the age of the students, which can help make the assessment criteria visible. It can help communicate our expectations and aims. Fundamentally though, teacher responses need to focus on specific praise and feed forward. When we're marking a main lesson book or when we're returning work to students, that is the most important thing, not the grading. So, Rawson suggests that when these things are functioning as he has described in his article on assessment, and indeed the research from John Hattie and Sue Swaffield and a bunch of other people in this area points to the same, then the school itself begins to learn. Not just the students in the school, but the teachers are learning, and the organization itself begins to learn and evolve and transform itself. And that is the purpose of good assessment practice. Through effective assessment practice, teachers assess their own teaching in terms of the effect that teaching is having on student learning and development. That is the number one thing we need to be focused on, whether we're teaching in a Waldorf school or another type of school. Teachers then share their evaluation, their self-evaluation and observations that have been shared with them, maybe by a peer assessor or an appraiser, with their colleagues on a regular basis. They share their learning and knowledge about that. And this enables individual insights to be discussed, to be tested collegially, and to flow back into the classroom, not just in that teacher's teaching, but other teachers can learn from that too. Good assessment leads to a transformation of teaching and learning. That is what Rawson is suggesting. And I have to say, in my own experience, I concur with that. I think that's absolutely right. When teachers use assessment intelligently in that way, we can begin to see the school as a learning organization. And that surely is something that we should be interested in Waldorf education. Very important. So that's the summary of the article. I've put some questions on the end of here to sort of prompt you, and I thought, you know, this is quite there's a lot of information here, and some of these are new terms, and having heard it once, we may understand some of it, but that doesn't necessarily lead it or us to being able to apply that in our teaching in a Waldorf context. So there are some questions on the end here that I've included for you to come back to afterwards. On the purpose of assessment, Rawson says that assessment is tentative, iterative, provisional, and ongoing. And in this way, teachers are able to observe the effect of their teaching on student learning and development and to adjust their teaching accordingly. So what do you think all of that means for our work together as Waldorf teachers? Very important question. Another one afterwards for you to think about, and before we go to discussion, we'll just bounce through these, Agnes, and then we can come back. Assessment criteria. Rawson says we need to make the assessment criteria visible and understood by the student, and that this empowers learners. How can we do this in ways that is appropriate to the subject we're teaching and to the age of the students? Can we, and is it appropriate for us to do this in class 1 and 2? And what does that look like? What does that look like in class 4 and 5? What does it look like in class 9 and 10? All interesting stuff to think about. If we think about the different approaches we talked about, collecting naturally occurring evidence, formative assessment for learning, the use of feedback and feed forward, summative or outcomes assessment, and opportunities for self and peer assessment. Which one of these do you do most frequently? Do you do them all? When and where do these approaches to assessment live in our teaching? How clear about this are you? And I think that when we think about why and perhaps what motivated Rawson to write this article and publish it in the research bulletin, the journal, I don't think, I mean, I have no firm evidence, but one of the things I would say from my experience is that for many of us, one or two of these approaches to assessment is something that we're familiar with and using, but maybe not a wide range of these things. And I sense that this is a bit of a call to action for us to think about this and raise our consciousness around effective assessment for learning. So how clear about that are you? And do you talk about that with your teacher colleagues? And if not, why not? I think this is important. Next. So in terms of assessment for learning, Rawson says students need to be clear about next steps in learning. How clear about this are you for your students? When marking and assessing student work, how do you determine their next steps? And how do you integrate that into your planning and teaching? Do you, in fact, having marked student work, make a note of the things you need to do next in your planning and teaching? And how do you go about that? And we talked about record keeping. So what kind of records do you keep of student learning? How often do you record them? And how often do you update that information? What do you think Rawson is suggesting we need to do here as teachers in Waldorf schools? Very interesting question. A question that I have on the template of every single unit plan that my teachers have to engage with is, what changes do you need to make to your planning and teaching and assessment practice as a result of the outcomes of this unit of learning, of your assessment? So what is Rawson really suggesting that we need to do here as teachers? There's a number of things he's asking us to think about and take up. So I think one of the ways that we can help to put that into practice is to make an action list for ourselves. Yeah. Fundamentally, he says that we need to think about assessment from a Waldorf perspective, yeah, in the context of the aims and tasks of the Waldorf School and our understanding of the developing child. But that doesn't excuse us from attending to these things. So what needs to go on your action list? I invite you to think about that. So that this is not just an intellectual understanding, but something that you integrate into your practice going forward. So that's the end of those slides. That is the summary of the article and the key points that Rawson makes in that article. And I now hand it back to Agnes for MC, and I invite us to have an interactive discussion about things that came out of that for you, things you noticed or things that might be helpful to clarify in relation to what that looks like in a Waldorf school, what that means for our work together and as teachers.